Hey, everybody. Welcome to this fifth session of Misconceptions about Consciousness. And as we wait for everyone to jump in, let's just take a few moments of silence together. Recognizing the depths of silence, the play of being, the dance of light and dark. In a place that has no name. All right, welcome. Good to see you all. So let me know if the sound is coming through. Hey, Tom, good to see you. Sue, Jen, good to see you, Jen. Sandeep, Magda, Lupita. All right. So we're on number 5. This is the series on misconceptions about consciousness. As we reflect on each of these, kind of what consciousness is, or what many of the spiritual traditions are talking about when we talk about consciousness, each one reveals a slightly different shade. And each one of these is an invitation, a slide to dive into a new aspect, kind of like those water slides at theme parks. You jump into the top and you float down and you splash into this pool. And these slides come from different angles, from different heights. Some curve, but they all ultimately end up in the same pool. So similarly, each of these statements is a kind of slide through which we can appreciate a new aspect of what consciousness might be beyond the standard discourse in society, and even behind and beyond some of the standard discourse in spirituality. So, so far we've looked at misconceptions such as consciousness is different from the body. Actually, that's a very common one. In the initial stages, we say body is one thing and consciousness is another, and therefore divest attention from one and onto the other. And these are all techniques, but are they fundamentally different? Number two, exploring consciousness is a way to avoid what's happening. Another myth. Consciousness is about oneness, right? This is a dangerous one in the sense that we always say this, it's about oneness, but again, that's about a technique. To say that it is about oneness itself is a technique because it's also about multiplicity, and it's also about neither one nor many nor two. So all of these are applicable. Consciousness is created by the brain. It can seem to be so when we distinguish matter from mind, and then we preference one over the other. And now we're on number five. And the fifth misconception is that consciousness is primarily an individual phenomenon. All right. So is it true that consciousness is primarily an individual phenomenon? Certainly in our society, it is. And that is why we are taking this three minds perspective today. Right. So from the three minds perspective, the first mind is the view that consciousness is an individual phenomenon. The sensation that this sense of I, this sense of identity is individuated, has a distinct boundary, has a beginning and an ending, either in space, which is the physical location, or a beginning and ending in time, which is what we call a lifetime, right? As we say, from the womb to the tomb, from the time the physical body aggregates and starts moving to the time the physical body starts to disintegrate and disaggregate and stop moving, that is within space and time. So, this sense of identity being individuated is itself a first mind phenomenon. This is the radical suggestion. So the idea that consciousness is primarily that, or even that it is only that, is where society is right now. And therefore, when we talk about, for example, transpersonal experience, it has to be classified as something different, as opposed to just a regular experience. It's we add that word trans because consciousness is understood as a matter of a given, an unexamined given. It is assumed to be individuated. When we move to the second mind experience, what we note is that consciousness is not restricted to the body. It is not restricted to the individual. It is not restricted to a lifetime. It is not restricted to a particular space. And it is not restricted by time. Right? So this is the second mind perspective. And here, consciousness is not primarily an individual phenomenon. And all of the so-called arguments or misunderstandings between what a person calls science and a person calls spirituality and a person calls philosophy and all this is simply because of this misunderstanding of the nature and boundary and malleability of identity. So, in between these perspectives, by the way, when we talk about the myth or the misconception that consciousness is primarily an individual phenomenon, in between that first mind perspective and what we might consider a second mind perspective proper, meaning that the fundamental experience that what I am, what this identity is something that is not localized, that is not strictly related to or limited by or contained by or produced by a body. Right? In between these two, there are all other kinds of identity that are actually transpersonal, but we don't think of them as transpersonal identities, right? A good example is your significant other or your partner. We have a pronoun for that, and it's called we. When we say we, it's understood that it is one I and an other I. And when there are two I's together, and when the sense of I-ness or the sense of identity expands to include both I's, now we have a new pronoun called we. And that is actually a transpersonal identity because it is beyond the individual person, right? And then a family is basically another we in which there may be 2, 3, 4, 10 or more individual identities. And we know that these are distinct transpersonal identities. These aren't just things that we're making up. We're not just saying that it's transpersonal to sound fancy. We know they're transpersonal and identities, and they have real life implications. Right? A classic example is if a person doesn't have enough food, if somebody in our family doesn't have enough food, then almost anybody would give them food. Nobody would say, well, how much money do you have? Right? Nobody would say, well, how hungry are you really before I give you food? Right? Because that sense of we, that transpersonal identity, goes beyond the individual sense of consciousness. And yet there are many people that if they don't have food, that most people are not concerned about them, right? We're not going around and trying to feed everybody. Why? Well, simple, because that sense of identity does not include that person also. There's a boundary to even that expanded kind of consciousness. So between the second mind awareness, which is not just restricted to what we call living things, that's another conversation itself, what is living and non-living, but the second mind is not restricted to ideas of living and non-living, right? So it goes beyond the idea of mind and matter and thing and being and life and death. It goes beyond all of these. But even prior to that, we can see there are so many transpersonal identities before we come down to the rigid, distinct sense of individuality that is me and just me, that individual. And that's what's called in spirituality usually as ego, right? So what we are recognizing as a first mind phenomenon, which is basically this sense of boundary, can span so many ranges, right? And what is usually talked about as ego is what is considered the most dense, the most encrusted, the most concretized aspect of that, at least in the spiritual community when it talks about ego. So that's the distinction between first mind and ego. And the point here is by looking at this, we can see that consciousness is indeed not restricted to an individual phenomenon. So consciousness is not primarily an individual phenomenon de facto, although we do recognize and appreciate that it can be experienced as such. And now we know that that is because it is a first mind phenomenon that is being experienced, which is simply one configuration of the mind. And when that configuration shifts, then what we experience as consciousness also changes. All right. Ego is our blocker, someone says. So, ego, depending on how we use ego, it can be a blocker. Also, recognize that without any ego, there's no sense of boundary and there's no sense of individuality. So, there has to be some ego to function, right? What is usually talked about in spirituality as having no ego or transcending the ego or going beyond the ego. This is not in an absolute sense, right? This is being spoken about in a inspirational and functional sense. There has to be some level of ego, no matter how much people may not like the word. There has to be some experience of this me, of identity as also individual, to be expressing through the body and as the body. Otherwise, the body would just be limp and it would soon disintegrate and it would no longer be a vehicle for expression. All right. So let's say ego can be a blocker and it can also be a wonderful tool to get certain things done. Lisa asks, do you believe we have souls? So from the second mind phenomenon, what we talk about as soul and then body and mind, that kind of classic triad or that classic breakdown, these are all aspects of the second mind, right? So on the first mind perspective, we have the distinct individuality, the discreteness, the difference, the manyness. From the second mind, we have that undifferentiated nature of consciousness, right? Boundlessness. And now somewhere in between is when we start to recognize, okay, there is something like this body. And wait a second, now there are these thoughts and feelings, and maybe that's mind. And then there's this energy kind of structure, and then there's something like a soul that seems to go from lifetime to lifetime or express from lifetime to lifetime. Right. So that is an in-between stage between the first mind and the second mind, where we're recognizing more and more and more of what our nature is. All right. Looking into becoming herbalist. Wonderful. Esperanza. Namaste. So, oh, there was one thing there. Let me see. Yeah, so Maria says any positioning leads to division. Even these myths are consciousness appearing confused to the little mind, right? So even when we're talking about misconceptions about consciousness, we have to create a division to say that these are misconceptions and these are right concepts, right? And it's kind of just a stepping stone. And once we see what are the quote unquote right concepts, then those two will become insufficient, right? So it's moving to this place of having no ground beneath the feet. It's moving to this place of weightlessness in a sense and becoming comfortable in absolute uncertainty while also being able to put certain footholds in place. Like right now, we're putting certain footholds in place so that we can talk about something called consciousness and a concept and a misconception and all of these. So being buoyant in uncertainty while also dancing with transient certainties is the dance. So I'm going to jump over to the YouTube channel and we will continue with a short meditation there and maybe another short Q&A. So if you'd like to join me, I'm going to go live in a couple minutes from here. Otherwise, I'll see you next time for episode 6 of Misconceptions.